Well, welcome again to another session of Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Ailes, I'm your moderator. As you can see, our session today is No Attention Equals No Benefit, increasing students' use of assignment feedback. And yes, that is a challenge at times. We are so fortunate to have with us Jean Mandernack, who is Executive Director of the Center for Innovation in Research and Teaching at Grand Canyon University. And her research focuses on enhancing student learning in the online classroom through innovative instructional and assessment strategies. And as we were talking before, that sounds like it's really fun and interesting to do. And Jean is going to tell us everything we would ever want to know about increasing students' use of assignment feedback. So it's all yours, Jean.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you everyone for taking an hour out of your day to join us today. As Bob mentioned, the issue of assignment feedback and getting students to really use assignment feedback isn't new. And if you've done any teaching, whether that's face-to-face, online, blended, high flex, it doesn't matter the mode. It's a challenge to get students to use the feedback we're giving them. And this is really problematic when we think about it in relationship to the existing research on feedback. In fact, when you start going through all of the different factors that can influence a student's learning experience, feedback almost always emerges at the top of the list. If it's not number one, it's definitely in the top three. Students like it because it helps them to correct conceptual errors, but more importantly, it's one of the few opportunities where they really get one-on-one guidance. When they get to feel like the instructor is talking to them and them alone, helping them to affirm their understanding, to correct things that they didn't understand, to provide additional resources that might be uniquely suited to that student. And not only are there the cognitive benefits, but particularly in the online classroom, research finds that it helps students feeling more engaged with the learning experience. They tend to feel more connected to their instructor. Students that receive and utilize feedback say that they're much more motivated and much more satisfied with their learning experience. So when we think about this body of research telling us how valuable feedback is, it's not really that surprising that when we ask students, what do you think really helps your learning? This survey happened to go to just online students, but we had about 5,000 of them reply to our survey. And overwhelmingly, they told us there were two things that they thought really helped their learning: feedback and engagement with the instructor. And we followed this survey up and said, okay, students are telling us feedback is really helpful. So how much time are faculty spending on feedback? And so what we did was we identified what we considered good online faculty. And they were identified by looking at a number of different indicators. We looked at their grade distribution. We looked at their peer evaluation scores from other faculty teaching online. We looked at their student end of course evaluations. And one of the metrics I found really valuable is we looked at their students' success in the next course that they took, because we really wanted to know, were these faculty truly preparing students to learn? And so we identified this group of faculty that scored high on those indicators, and we simply asked them, where do you spend their time? And we had them track and self-report their own time. And what they told us was where they spent time lined up almost exactly with what students told us really helped their learning. And so the vast majority of their time was spent engaging in discussions and giving students feedback. In fact, about 40% of their time was spent giving students feedback. And that's really what led to this current research that we were looking at. Students tell us feedback is important. Faculty tell us that they're spending 40% of their time giving this one-to-one good guiding feedback. But there's a challenge. Students can't benefit if they don't actually use the feedback. And equally important when we're talking about our faculty time and how we're all very, very busy, Most of the research tells us faculty are spending far more than 40 hours a week with all their obligations. If faculty are spending 40% of their time on feedback and students aren't looking at it, that's a waste of time. And so that's really what drove this study, was this simple question: are students actually looking at the feedback? Now notice, this is a precursor to the next question, which is, if they're looking at it, can they effectively use it? Is it valuable? Is it guiding? Do they know how to use it? All important questions. But those questions do not matter if they've never even looked at the feedback. So that's where we decided to start. It was a simple question of, are the students even looking at the feedback? And we defined looking at the feedback by simply opening it up. Now, once they open it up, can I tell you for sure that they read it? No. Can I tell you how long they spent looking at it? No. There's a number of other pedagogical questions that are equally important. But for the purposes of our study, we just agreed on the simple fact: if they don't open it, none of the other questions matter. They can't benefit from something they never look at. And so our learning management system has a feature, and you can see underneath where it says their grade has been published, there's a little eyeball icon. And that eyeball icon is time-stamped. And what that icon tells us is, when did the student look at their feedback? And so as an example here on the screen, you'll notice that under topic 6 review, it says grading done. And then below that, the very first student got 20 out of 20 points, and they looked at their feedback 8 days previous from when this was pulled. The second student down also got 20 out of 20, but notice that there is no icon. That's what tells us the student never even clicked on the feedback to see it. So if it shows an icon and a timestamp, we know the student looked at it, or at least opened it. If it didn't, that's what we were interested in. How many students literally didn't even click on it to be able to potentially benefit from the information that was left for them? And so that was the basis of where we started this data poll. Before we dove too far into it, though, we actually did some focus groups with faculty, because even though the learning management system gives us this information, we don't know how faculty are using it. We don't know if they're using it. We don't know how they might be using it or what purpose they might be using it for. So we gathered faculty, and these were just randomly selected faculty. These were not the same faculty that were considered our good faculty for the time study. Randomly selected faculty, and we said, come and let us know. Are you using this feature of the learning management system? And Megan asked in the chat, what LMS are we using? Ours is actually a homegrown LMS called Halo. Other learning management systems often have similar features. So I would encourage you to check whether you're in Desire to Learn, Blackboard, Canvas. Depending on the package that your university gets, they may or may not have a similar feature that will let you know if the students are accessing that information. Even within your learning management system, it's a matter of whether your university subscribes to that feature as well. So if you're unsure if you have it, reach out to your learning management coordinator and talk to them about whether that's a feature you currently have, if it's enabled, and if it's not enabled, is it something that can be enabled? But that's going to vary based on the learning management system. Our learning management system is called Halo. So back to our focus groups. We just sat down to ask faculty, how many of you are using it? How many of you aren't using it? And if you're not using it, why? And if you are using it, how are you using it? Well, what we first of all found was the first question of how many faculty are and aren't using it wasn't one that could be easily answered, because faculty told us, oh, I sometimes use it, I sometimes don't, it's targeted use. So we didn't have a clear metric of who was and was not using it. But what we did have were some pretty clear themes about their views on this feature. For faculty that told us, I don't always use it, or I'm not really sure, they basically told us two things. One, they knew it was there, they just weren't really sure what to do with that information. So they were kind of lacking a good purpose-driven guidance on how they would use that information. The second theme that emerged was they said, it's not my responsibility. And some faculty just really felt like their role was to provide the feedback, and whether or not the students used it was the students' responsibility. And as such, they didn't see that as an important indicator for them to take into consideration. On the flip side, for the faculty that were using it, they actually gave us quite a few different reasons for why they were using it. Probably most commonly, they were just using it as a guidance tool for students. So when a student was struggling in the class, maybe they would reach out to the faculty and say, I'm not getting it. What can I do to improve my grade? They would use it and they would say, well, here's what the metrics are telling us about when you're using the feedback. Let's take a look. Are you using it consistently? When are you using it? Are you using it in a timely manner so that you're able to take that feedback and help you for future assignments? And so they would often use that to just help the students really understand their own patterns within the learning management system. The other thing they would do is they would use it as an indicator if students even understood how to access the feedback. And this theme was particularly common for faculty that were teaching some of the first courses at the university. So the introductory courses and the general studies courses, those faculty were most likely to say, I often look at it because my students might not realize that when they click on their numerical grade, that's going to show them what the instructor said. So they would use it to proactively go into the learning management system, identify students who weren't looking at it, and then reach out to those students with, most of them said with a how-to tutorial or a video saying, hey, noticed you weren't looking at your feedback. As a reminder, here's how you're going to get to that feedback and access that feedback. They also said when students would get a hold of them upset, wanting extra credit, seeking a grade change, just kind of unhappy with where they were at, they would often use that as a, let's talk about your investment in the learning process compared to my role. And so they would use it to help students understand really kind of their expectations for them in that teaching and learning dynamic. So knowing all of this and knowing that we had wide variability in how students were using it and how faculty were viewing this feature, we started with a very simple analysis. We simply looked, yes or no. Did students actually click open the feedback to see it? And what we found was the answer was sort of. On the good side, we had about 66% of undergraduates that were, so over half. And at the graduate level, it was even higher. It was around 77%. So overall, we went, good news. About 68% of the students are clicking on the feedback to at least view the feedback. But on the flip side, that means we've got about 30% of our students, 30%, that are not even opening it. And not only does that mean 30% of our students are not benefiting from the potential learning gains they could get, from the connection they could get, but also that means instructors are wasting 30% of that feedback time. And so when we go back and think about this, what the data tells us is that on average, online faculty are spending right around 12 hours a week in a course. 40% of that 12 hours is being spent on grading. Now, I didn't do the math on my head right quick before this presentation, but that's a decent chunk. We're talking right around 5 hours of their week they're spending on grading. 30% of that 5 hours is now wasted because students simply aren't looking at the feedback. So then we decided, well, before you start taking action on this, it would be important to dive a little bit deeper and see if we could tease apart what might be happening here and what patterns might be emerging. And so then we said, well, perhaps there's a difference in the rate of feedback as a function of whether they tend to be an online student, whether they are on campus, or whether they're what we call a traditional online. And for us, a traditional online is your traditional age student who immediately after high school goes into an online education. So a little bit different than our regular online students who tend to be more non-traditional aged students. So we looked at all of our data and we broke it apart according to the mode of learning. And what we found was it didn't really change that much. Our online students were slightly more likely to use the feedback. And that lines up really well with the research that tells us that online students look at it not only as a means of correcting conceptual errors, but they also look at it as a means of engagement, motivation, connection with the instructor. So because online students put a little more weight into their feedback, it wasn't surprising that we saw the rate of use a little bit higher for our online students. But even within that context, a quarter of them, 24%, were still not even opening it. And when it really hits you is when you go 565 of those students. That is a huge number of students who aren't even opening it. So there is zero potential gain in the feedback that they're getting. So then we said, well, perhaps feedback is viewed differentially as a function of the type of student that they are. So we took all of the students that were in this data set, and this was a randomly pulled data set of 10,000 student points. So we went through all courses, all modes, all levels, and we just randomly pulled 10,000 data points. And in this then, one of the things we looked at was what was the final grade that they received in the course. And we divided the students into categories based on the final grade they had in the course. So we had what we called the high achieving students. Those were all the students that received an A in the course. Medium achievement, those were the B's and the C's, and low achieving, those was the D and the F's. And then we went back and we said, okay, let's rerun. Did they look at the feedback as a function of what level of student that they were? Again, not a lot of changes. At the high achieving, they were just slightly more likely to look at that feedback, but really it wasn't dramatically different. And here is where we really started to dig into, what does this mean? How do we help students to be better learners? Because high achieving students, we could argue, are probably going to do okay without that feedback. So in theory, we could even say, let's imagine it was flipped and that most of our high achieving students weren't looking at the feedback. The fact that they possess the relevant knowledge, skills, and ability to be a high achieving student means that they probably were going to be able to succeed even if they weren't receiving the feedback. But when we start to get into the medium and the low achieving students, would they benefit if there was a way to motivate those student groups, particularly those student groups, to actually look at their feedback? Because we have students that are clearly struggling, particularly in that low achieving student group. And yet 35% of them aren't looking. Now, what we don't know is, are they not looking because they don't know it's there and they just lack the ability to navigate the learning management system effectively? Are they not looking because they have a history of not being able to use it? They don't find it helpful. They don't find it valuable. So now they've just given up and their pattern has been, I don't look because I don't find it helpful. Are they not using it because they don't have time, which we do know the time a student has available to invest in their courses is linked to those final course grades, and more time typically correlates with higher course grades. And so it's possible that lower achieving students simply have to prioritize their time and feedback has not been for them a priority. We don't know what the answer is. And I mention this because this is one of the future studies that we have started to dive into, but I would encourage others to dive into this as well, taking a look at what are the reasons that students aren't accessing the feedback? Because if we could identify those reasons, it might be a factor of differential investment to help students really see and utilize that feedback. We also then just took a look and we split it apart and we said, okay, well, maybe it's the assignment itself. Maybe it's not their overall course grade. Maybe when a student looks at their numerical score, that's what gives them the indicator, should I look at feedback or should I not? With the idea being that if you got a lot of the points on the assignment, so got an A or 100%, maybe you just aren't motivated to look at the feedback because that score alone tells you, I understood, I get it, I don't need the feedback. Versus as the score decreased, perhaps the rate of viewing the feedback would increase. And we didn't find that. In fact, we found the opposite pattern. Students were quite likely to view the feedback when they got full credit. In fact, full credit and the students receiving A's were the highest rates of viewing. So the students that had the least conceptual errors were the most likely to take a look at the feedback. Now, again, we're just theorizing here, but as a psychologist, I started to wonder, perhaps this really does start tapping into the idea that feedback is more about connection, motivation, those kinds of things. And maybe when students receive a high score, they're actually just wanting to reaffirm and feel good about themselves. And so they're more likely to go in and look at that feedback because they're not anticipating that it will be negative in any way. So it's not threatening. Could it be? Possibly. We don't know. That's something else we want to take a look at. But what we found was we actually saw a little bit of a drop, not a lot, but a little bit of a drop down to when they were getting a complete F, then it looked a little bit more like the students that were getting the A's and B's, because then they were at least a little more likely to go and take a look. But the C and especially the D students were the least likely to look. Now, one of the things that I found interesting was if a person received 0%, that indicated that, the way we coded it here, that they didn't even submit an assignment. So literally they didn't turn anything in. And yet 40% of students that didn't turn in an assignment and received a 0 actually clicked on that 0 to open it up and see what feedback was left for them. That was one of the surprising ones for me, because I started thinking, what would be their motivation to look at the feedback when they didn't submit anything? This might be an opportunity. Those students not submitting might actually now be seeking it out and looking as feedback as, help me. I didn't have a clue, so I didn't even submit it. But perhaps as instructors, we need to be giving more feedback for the students who aren't submitting anything, because they're actually looking and seeking out feedback despite not having any sort of a submission. Equally interesting was when we looked at the no credit assignments. So everything that was in those upper categories, anything between 100% and 0%, that was something that was going to count towards the student's overall course grade. But we had a decent chunk of assignments, about 1,000 out of the 10,000 assignments, where the instructor said, this is not a graded assignment. This is just a credit, no credit. If they turned it in, they got credit. So this was just a participation-based assignment. And what we found was students were still looking, about half of them, even if it didn't impact their grade, 56% of them were still clicking on that icon to be able to view and see what feedback was left for them. We also took a look and said, does the rate of viewing change as the term goes on? These were accelerated classes, so they were 8-week classes. And so we looked at, did the rate of opening and the viewing feedback shift throughout the semester? And generally speaking, the answer was no. The only exception to this is if we look at the feedback given for weeks 7 and 8, that was a chunk lower. And I guess I didn't really find that surprising, because now the course would have ended. And so the assignments they submitted in week 7 are not graded until week 8. It ends week 8, the course is over. So now they're receiving feedback after week 8 and the course has ended. We're still getting about half the students that are coming back into a closed course to check their feedback, but it did drop off a little bit once the course was near that end of the course point. Now that data goes back and gives us a little more of that indication that students are at least seeking to correct conceptual errors, because once the course was over, they kind of moved on and they were shifting out of that, am I understanding this course content, and most likely moving into the next course in their program. We also just took a look at how long, what delay is there between the instructor posting the feedback and the student actually looking at it. And it was huge. We actually found that on average, it was 2.6 days, but the standard deviation was 7 days. So students were coming back long after the feedback was posted to go ahead and take a look at that. So wide variability in terms of when do the students look at it. Again, if we're looking at feedback as this is helping students learn in kind of a cumulative building fashion, this is an interesting data point only because we can start thinking about, are students using the feedback if they're waiting 7 days and it's an accelerated course, which means the next assignments are already happening and they're already moving forward. So it might just be a really good kind of like teaching point for students to help them understand that the longer they're waiting to use that feedback, the less value it's going to have in correcting those future conceptual errors. Again, when we look, did that feedback delay vary across the term? Yes, it started to drop off, but again, I interpret this with a lot of caution, because essentially what it's saying is by the end of the semester, if they didn't check right away in the end of the semester, they weren't starting their next class and then jumping back in and checking their feedback. So early on, there was a little bit more of a delay when the class was still in session and you were still actively engaged. And then as the class started winding down, you did not see a lot of students, weeks after the class coming back into that previous class. So all of this dicing and slicing of the data really came back to a pretty consistent finding. On the good side, yay, 2/3 really are using the feedback. They're at least clicking on it. They're viewing it. But on the flip side, that means 1/3 aren't. And that's 1/3 of that instructional time investment that is completely wasted, because there is no value giving feedback that students don't look at. So this then moved us into phase 2 of our research, which was really, okay, if we know that 1/3 of the students aren't looking at the feedback, how do we change that? Now, this is driven by the assumption that feedback is good, valuable, corrects conceptual errors, does all these good things. So what do we need to do? Well, it kind of breaks into 3 broad categories. One, we looked at the feedback from students, because following this big data pull, we just did a little survey and we asked students, talk to us about why you don't click on the feedback if you don't click on it and what motivates you to do so. And so one of the categories that we looked at is, how do we just change students' behavior? The second category we looked at was really kind of going under the assumption that, let's just assume that 1/3 of the students aren't going to look at the feedback. But also we have to know that we don't know which ones are and which ones aren't. And so we can't not give feedback because 2/3 are looking. But if we can increase the efficiency by which faculty are giving that feedback, we can at least decrease that time wasted for students that aren't accessing it. And then the last part is just the administrative policies. What guidance are faculty given? What structure are we utilizing within our learning management system? What policies exist about feedback and students' use and faculty giving it? And if we can look at these 3 areas, perhaps we can decrease the time wasted and increase the students' use of the feedback. And so when we dove into these areas, what we found were there were a few kind of overarching patterns that emerged. Number one, students told us that they kind of sometimes just get bored in their class, and there is just so much to look at, and there's so many things to click on that they just don't get there. And so we looked at when were students more likely to look at feedback. And one of the things we found was, I'm going to call it a novelty effect for now, because I don't know if it'll last if we really got faculty changing their behavior. But when faculty were using multimedia feedback, so either providing a video, providing audio, the vast majority of multimedia feedback we looked at was actually a screencast. So the faculty would pull up the student's paper or submission on the screen, they would turn on a screencast, and they would talk the students through their grading and say, like, this is what you did really well, here's where you messed this up, here's what I would suggest changing. But it was a combination of the instructor's voice, the student's assignment, and the instructor's video that had the highest rate of student use. Again, I don't know yet, but we're digging into this as well, if it's because multimedia feedback is actually more powerful, or if it's because we had a novelty effect. But either way, right now, if we want to get students to use our feedback, we could tap into that novelty effect and increase the use of multimedia feedback. The other thing students told us is that oftentimes they felt like it didn't matter if they looked at the feedback because they had already moved on. And they said, the feedback on this assignment wasn't going to help me on the next assignment anyway, so it didn't matter. And so even if we think of our curriculum, scaffolding assignments so that there is value and that students are using the feedback to learn moving forward. Students have at least told us that that would increase the use because they overwhelmingly care about their grades. But if they don't think the feedback is going to help link to that and improve their grades, they were less likely to take a look at it. The other thing that they said was that they didn't always know what to do with the feedback. So they would discover that if they were in a time crunch, they would just skip it because they didn't always have an idea. So even if we could start giving some like response directives, like in the feedback, telling students, here's what you should do with it. Like you should go back and review this material, or you should resubmit this portion, or you should utilize this resource. But they said if they had more guidance on how to make that feedback meaningful in an action-oriented way, they would be much more likely to use it. The other thing they said was sometimes the feedback was so general that they didn't feel like it helped them. So the more targeted and specific we can make the feedback would be helpful. They also said that sometimes it's just like they're getting feedback on everything. And so to go in and click on all these different spots didn't always feel like it was valuable, particularly if they said, you know, in a week we might have 3 or 4 assignments, and the instructor feedback, if it was just like good job, nice work, they would kind of quit clicking on it. So they said, you know, if there were assignments that were really intentionally selected and the instructor said, this assignment has detailed feedback, make sure you read it, that they would be much more likely to go and read it. And so even as instructors, us deciding where to put our time and effort and then telling students, this is where we put our time and effort, it would increase the likelihood that they would see it. The other one we found, and this one was probably the easiest one to address, is students often went, I just kind of forget to go back and check. They're like, it's there, and I know I can go back and check, but if the learning management system doesn't like notify me that the feedback is available, or the instructor doesn't notify me, they just forget. And so just giving some sort of push notification. If your learning management system doesn't have a feature that automatically tells students that feedback has been posted, just sending an announcement. Or if you use a push notification service like Remind or another texting app, just a quick message to students that says, I just posted all the grades and feedback for assignment 3. Don't forget to take a look. That simple notification that the feedback was there increased viewing rates. Likewise, just giving one-to-many announcements, this not only told students feedback was there, but also telling students like, I posted your individual feedback, go look at it, but here's some of the big picture things I want you all to think about. And so making an announcement that talks about big picture trends and then directing them to go and look at their individual feedback. Also they told us that would increase the likelihood. Another one that I personally have not used, but several of my faculty have, is actually putting what they call little Easter eggs in the feedback. So telling students, be sure to look at your feedback because if I posted X and you respond to it, you can earn an extra bonus point. So for example, one faculty member told me when they were studying sensory perception cues, that in the feedback they said to the students, if you go and find a picture on the internet demonstrating whatever Gestalt principle, and they would say which one, email it to me and you can earn a bonus point. But the only place the faculty member mentioned it was in the feedback. And once they started doing that, they said students became much more likely to go and look at that feedback in case one of those little bonus point Easter eggs was in there. The other thing students said is when they get super busy and push comes to shove, if they have to focus on their grades and they're already looking forward to the next assignment, they don't always go back and look at the previous assignment because they don't know how it relates. So if that feedback gave them an opportunity to earn back some credit. So if it said, you know, you messed up on this or you didn't understand this, please fix it and you can earn some credit back. Students said they would be much more likely to go back in there and take a look at that feedback if they thought they could do that. They also really liked it if the feedback clearly justified and explained the grades. As much as it drives us faculty members crazy that students focus so much on their grades, we can use this to our advantage. And we just tie the feedback to the grades that they're receiving, and they're going to be more likely to take a look. If you can integrate that feedback with early alert systems, if you have early alerts on who's struggling and not, and be able to really guide those students that are struggling in your course through their feedback, Students said that would help because it starts linking that overall performance to the individual grades they're doing. And anything that you can do in your LMS that really makes it clear the feedback is available. Interestingly, that was the most common thing students told us was, I just forget to look. Or I look a couple times and the grades aren't posted yet, and then I forget to go back. So anything we can do to just bring it to their attention again helps to increase their use of that. Then on the instructional side, and again, this was under the idea that we're never going to get every student to look at their feedback. Well, I shouldn't say never. I hope we can. It's not likely, but recognizing that some of our investment in the creation of feedback is going to result in wasted time. If we can help faculty be more efficient, we're at least decreasing the time that's wasted and allowing them to still do good feedback. Some of this can be done simply by providing more resources to our instructors. So maybe we can give them feedback banks on things like APA style or writing errors or other things that would be common across disciplines and courses. If you have many faculty teaching a course, even having them come together and share feedback banks about conceptual errors and specific assignment errors and things like that. Related to that, it's just giving them course guides that have some of those feedbacks and some stock feedback that instructors could use so that they're not having to continually rewrite and retype things that they're reusing again and again and again. Within the course, even just giving, whether it's in the course itself or giving it to instructors, giving some assignment exemplars, giving some feedback templates, anything we can do to make it easier for them to give high quality feedback by providing them additional support. Likewise, if it's a centralized course curriculum and it's being developed in a standardized manner, you might look at, can we give examples of an assignment getting feedback that we embed right in the course as feed-forward information? Can we have more detailed rubrics so that the instructor isn't having to do quite so much of that individual typing? They can rely more on those rubrics. Even doing a lot of embedded how-to tutorials. These are particularly helpful for things like writing style, grammar, general writing, citations, those kinds of things. Embedding those resources into the course to prevent errors so instructors just don't have to spend as much time doing feedback on those errors. And increasing the students' role, asking the students to share examples and to share best practices so we can start to build some of those things. And then even in our faculty training, giving more guidance on how do we use one-to-many feedback strategies? What are some of the ways to incorporate multimedia in a really quick and easy fashion? For example, a lot of people know about screencasts, but the idea of like turning on a program, doing a download, doing an upload, captioning it, it just feels overwhelming. Maybe we need to teach them about the technologies that make that quicker. Something like Loom that can auto-transcribe and doesn't have upload and download times so that faculty now know the tools to make this happen most effectively. And even within the use of feedback banks, teaching faculty how to use text expanders to be able to automate the use of those feedback banks using hotkeys so that they can just use the information much more quickly to still provide that detailed, individualized feedback to students. And then even more broadly, just thinking about what are the administrative policies? You know, do we require at institutions faculty to give detailed feedback on every assignment? If we do, maybe we need to rethink that policy. Maybe we could start saying, you know what, we're going to make a policy that discussion threads or whatever types of assignments really don't require much feedback unless the student scores below a certain threshold. And if that's the case, we're going to, you know, have some stock feedback available that they can guide the student. Or maybe we're going to say, you know what, if any given week, we're really going to tell you which is the assignment that we want you to do detailed feedback on, and you can kind of move faster on the other ones, because then we could guide students' attention on that. Maybe it's going to be as a function of their grade. Maybe it's going to be the timing. Maybe it's going to be that we tell faculty early in the semester, we want you to really front load that feedback because that's going to get students on the right foot and guide them. And as the term goes on, you can start to drop it off because we know they're not using it as much in week 7 or week 8. But just thinking about how do our policies surrounding those feedbacks help faculty to guide their investment of time? And do our policies about the use of feedback actually align with how students are using it and how we're truly maximizing the impact of that feedback on the student learning experience? Even within this broad structure, also thinking about how do we support faculty so that it's not completely their responsibility? Is it possible to bring in tutors, writing centers, grading aides, teaching assistants, and other things to help alleviate some of that really workload associated with giving feedback? Any given university is going to have different resources, different class sizes, different expectations, but it can be helpful just to take a look at, within the context of a given university, how do those administrative policies impact where a faculty spends their time, and is that time going to be reflected in actual student learning gains? Now, as I've talked about all of this, one of the keys is it goes back to what our learning management system would tell us. We have a learning management system that will tell us if the student is looking at their feedback. Every person needs to think for themselves, what is available? If your learning management system doesn't actually tell you that, what does it tell you? Because even though in this particular study, we were looking at students' use of assignment feedback to help us think about how do we guide instructional time, how do we better support the student, your learning management system might give you other information. It might give you page views. It might give you how long they're spending in any given area of the course, what they're going back to. Use that information to really think about, how do I design a good learning experience? And also, how do I not waste my time as an instructor doing a lot of things that aren't going to matter? Related to this, just last week, I was talking to an instructor and he was showing me these really amazing videos he was making. And he said, you know, they're taking a lot of time. He said he was spending about 15 to 20 hours per video getting them made. And they were gorgeous. They were narrated, they had graphics, they had his face. I mean, they were really, really good. When I said, these are amazing, you know, tell me about how it's impacted the student learning experience. And the faculty member looked at me and he goes, I don't know what you mean. And I said, well, is it helping? Are students more engaged? Are they spending more time on it? Are they making less errors? And he's like, I don't know. And I said, well, what are your viewing rates? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, let's take a look. I hate to share this out loud because it about crushed this poor instructor's soul. But when we looked at the viewing rates, he was only getting about a 7% viewing rate. He was spending 15 to 20 hours a week, and students weren't using it. And no matter how beautiful these videos were, and no matter how amazing his design of these videos were, any time investment in an instructional resource that is not being used has no impact. And so that really, even though my presentation is on feedback, that's really one of the takeaway messages of this. If your learning management system won't give you this specific piece of data, what will it give you? And how can you use that to enhance the learning experience and to really guide the instructional behavior? With that said, I think I left about 5 minutes if anybody has questions or comments or thoughts. I will say this is a launching point for research. I mentioned several of the research studies we have going. One of them is that we're actually diving in right now to this first initial data set. And again, it's 10,000 data points, and we're coding it by assignment type. We're going to look and see, does it matter? Are students more likely to look at things that are a paper versus a quiz versus a discussion versus a lab report? And we're going to see if that matters. We're still coding that data. We're also looking to see, does the relative point value of the assignment make a difference? So is it that if it doesn't count for much, students are less likely to look at that feedback, and if it counts for a lot, they're more likely to look at it? We're diving into that. We're also taking a look at the quality of the feedback, and this is probably the study that's going to take us the most time, because we're going through and we're doing a qualitative kind of analysis of the feedback the instructor gave, and then we're looking at future weeks. So if previous feedback was really good, detailed, high quality feedback, does that dictate future likelihood that the student is going to look at that feedback? So we have a number of studies that we're digging into, but the driving kind of lesson learned here is, how do we know what students are using, and how do we shape and guide their behavior so that we're not wasting our own time? I'll now be quiet so that you can share questions, comments, thoughts, anything that comes to mind. Well, I'll answer a question nobody has asked. Because one question that usually comes up when I talk to people about this is, if you had to give one piece of advice for instructors right now to increase the likelihood that students will look at their feedback, what would it be? Hands down, post an announcement or send an email that the feedback's there. Quick, it's easy. You can go into your learning management and say, send the email to everybody, or you can do an announcement that then pushes out to everybody that simply says, I'm done grading week 3, go into the grade book, click on the number to see your feedback. That alone has the biggest impact that we found thus far on actually shaping students' behavior. Just telling them it's there. Yeah, Shelley commented, like, do we have this in Canvas? I think, knock on something, cross my fingers, I think it's a feature available. So it depends on whether your campus has the package that includes the feature and whether your learning management administrators have activated the feature. So if you just hop into your course and you're like, nope, we don't got it, go ahead and do step 2 and reach out to your learning management coordinator and say, I'm wanting to see whether the students open the feedback. Can Canvas help me with this? Because they might have ways that they can either show you or enable it or do other things. Megan shared that she noticed her people weren't looking at their feedback either. And so she just started the course with a how-to module, like, here's how you would view it. And she said that helped. I agree completely. I started doing that, not in all my courses, although I probably could, but I started doing it in my general psychology course because it's a general studies course. It's often first-time students. It's often first-time online learners. And so that course in particular, I was concerned that they didn't even know how to see it. And so I just did a screencast. So I turned it on, I put my learning management system in student view. I had a test student, which I know for sure Canvas will give you a test student in a student view. And then I gave the test student some fake feedback and I just turned on a screencast. My favorite screencast program is Screencast-O-Matic. You can do free screencasts that are up to 15 minutes long. And I just did a screencast that said, when feedback's available, here's what you need to do. And I walked them through and I talked to them and I said, you know, click on the number and it's going to come up and here's what you do. And yeah, I did it in my intro courses. Yeah, and the Screencast-O-Matic licenses are cheap. Megan said that last she knew 3 years was $36. And that's really close to what I was thinking. I was thinking when I went up to their pro license, maybe it was $15 a year, and maybe I should have done the 3-year one because I could have saved $3 a year. But yeah, Screencast-O-Matic is cheap. And that's if you even do go to use the pro one as opposed to the free version. Loom also gives you free options to do screencast. The difference is Loom has a much shorter time limit. I think is it 2 or 3 minutes for the free version? I don't remember what it is offhand. Don't quote me on the Loom time limit, but Loom, L-O-O-M, also has a free screencast option that's really quick and easy. And the other thing I like about Loom, I don't know if this is true about Screencast-O-Matic, I'd have to say, I use Loom when I'm doing my multimedia feedback. And even if your learning management system doesn't tell you if they've seen the feedback, Loom will. So now you could go into Loom and it will show you student by student, did they view the screencast? And so even if you're in Canvas and Canvas doesn't give you that stamp to let you know they've seen it, if you do the multimedia feedback in Loom, Loom will give you the stamp that lets you know if they saw it and when they looked at it. You know, when this is over, I'm going to immediately Google and see if I can find out what Canvas gives everyone in the most common Canvas version. I just don't know. Good to know. Kate said that the new Canvas Studio, an add-on that's a lot more robust. So that's the other thing. If you're a Canvas user, perhaps ask your learning management administrator if they have access to Canvas Studio and if it's been activated. That's the other thing I discovered when I've been working with various learning management systems. Sometimes it's not what the learning management system itself has, it's which feature has your campus activated. Because even in the open source version of Canvas, they can pick and choose a lot of different features to turn on or turn off. And apparently the Canvas Studio must be pricey. I have no idea, but Megan gave us a $3 sign on that one. And Kate confirmed, correct, not cheap.
What LMS do you guys use, Gene?
We are in Halo, and Halo is a homegrown LMS that GCU collaborated with the provider to create it. So it used to be called, what were we before we were Halo? I see Mary Beth on here. She might remember what we were before we were Halo. But yeah, it became Halo, I think 2 or 3 years ago, but it's a homegrown learning management system. Loud Cloud, thank you. Thanks, Mary Beth. Yeah, it was called Loud Cloud. Loud Cloud evolved, and now it's Halo, but it's one that Grand Canyon University works in conjunction with the learning management system to develop it.
Yeah, I remember Loud Cloud from way back, but yeah, I never heard of Halo.
Yeah, I actually don't know. When you say that, I don't know if other universities have access and are using it. They might, I don't know. I do know that we've worked in conjunction to build it, but I don't know if after that they sell it out. I don't have enough info to answer that one for you. Shelly took a Google for me and she said, at the moment, Canvas is saying that there is not a way, but their suggestion is to tell them to respond to the comments to verify that they've received it. And I do know in Canvas, if you're in the grade book and you've posted comments, in the grade book itself, students can, like in the speed grader, I think that's what it's called in Canvas, students can respond to that. So apparently there's not a pretty analytic at the moment in Canvas, which is a bummer. I guess you could just ask them to respond if you were using it as a way to help navigate for students that were struggling. You could just put a little thing in that gives them like a, yep, I saw this, or thumbs up or whatever, but unfortunately not a quick and easy analytic. Thank you, Shelly. You just saved my post-session Google session.
Well, I think we're out of time.
I think so.
Darn.
Well, and thank you for having me, Bob. These are always wonderful.
Hey, you can never retire. You always have to be here to do a session for my conference.
My pleasure. Happy to.
So it's always great to have you. Like I've said before, you always have interesting things, practical things that people can take back and try. So that's perfect for what we want to do at the conference.
Wonderful. Have a great day, everyone.